Good morning and welcome to a new episode. I don't know if it's the morning actually today, but today we're talking about advanced camera settings. I want to go through whatever settings I'm using, why, and how you can actually get the best results, because I've got a bunch of questions from you guys asking what autofocus mode do I use, what light metering mode do I use, and why, in what circumstances, how come I always nail my focus. Well, let me explain to you exactly why. The first thing you do when you have a camera obviously is put a battery inside. While I'm doing this, I hope you grab your camera so we can walk through it together. The most important is to select, and obviously it's going to be situational, it's going to be selecting the mode you want to be shooting in. Most of the time I'm shooting either in aperture priority or manual mode. Aperture priority gives me the creative direction to choose my depth of field, which is something I always want to be in control of. Manual will allow me to make advanced creative choices, especially when I'm shooting with very strong differences of light, dynamic range, or when I want to do long exposures when I shoot at night, for example, great examples, or if I want to do shorter, like slow shutter speeds. Aperture priority mode for me is a must for the simple reason that you guys shot with it on week 3. It allows you to be quick with it. You can react to situations, and the first thing you want to do when you're in aperture priority is to go in your settings and find something, if you have it on your camera, called minimum shutter speed. And that minimum shutter speed will allow you, as I explained, to shoot not below that certain speed. I always use that, and I will change it depending on what I'm shooting. Now that that's said, the next thing I want to be changing is my autofocus mode and the focus point I'm going to be using. What kind of points I want to be using. My camera does an amazing job at focusing, but I need to be in control of where the focus is going to go, because there are a few modes that you can be using. You can use a focus area, which is called wide, and it's going to take the whole frame, and you're going to leave to the camera to decide where you should be focusing. Then there's zone, which is similar, center, which is going to have a point that is locked in the center. What I use the most is flexible point. Flexible point allows you to actually move the dot on your frame with a little joystick at the back on the Sonys, and depending on your camera, you'll have that option too, maybe even touch screen. And the most important here is that I want to be able to lock my focus on a certain point. I always want to know where my focus point is, because I need to make sure my focus is tack sharp on the point I want, on my subject. So being in flexible spot will allow me to do that. Then there is another mode which is called lock on AF, which is called tracking on some camera, which allows you to have a flexible spot that you can place, and then it's going to track the object that you're focusing on while the object is moving, which is great for action, which is great when people are moving towards you, away from you. This is the must have if you're trying to track, for example, someone jumping in the air or just someone walking around you on a frame like Alex is doing right now. Very, very efficient, but it's not bulletproof. So sometimes I stick with my flexible spot and I will move with my camera, or I will try to anticipate where my subject will be. Next setting, the focus mode. We haven't talked about it yet. It is either AFS, which is single focus mode, meaning focus once and then it locks the focus where it focused. And if my subject moves in and out after, it's going to be out of focus. Or it can be AFC, which is continuous focus. It means that as long as I press my button to focus, the autofocus will adapt, which means if my subject's coming towards me, it's going to keep focusing and focusing on the dot. Next, what do we have? Well, light metering is very important. How do you actually want your camera to meter your light? What does that mean? It means that your camera is going to give you information on the light available in your frame, but it will depend on the light metering mode you use. If you use multi, then you're going to leave it up to the camera to kind of try to take everything in the frame, and then they're trying to find the best. If you work a lot with that, that's cool. I love it. Now there's another mode which is called spot, which a lot of people use, and I used to use it, but nowadays I don't use it anymore. It's going actually to take the light only on the small spot that you have decided on. which is usually linked to your focus point, but for some camera you can unlink it, and depending on where you're going to point your camera, you're going to have completely different results. It's an interesting mode, but I stopped using it because the sensors got good enough that I can actually play with a dynamic range to get an image that I can still edit properly after. On the Sonys, there is another mode called highlight, and highlights will actually tell you information about those highlights. So your camera is going to try to match the light so that those highlights are well exposed. It's a very good mode to use if you're in harsh light conditions, you're doing street photography, or you have high dynamic range in that frame and you want to make sure you're not blowing out those highlights. You want to really expose for those highlights. This is a great mode to use. And that's about it in terms of light metering. Next, a very helpful tool is that 0 to -3 here, that little round, we call that exposure correction. When you're shooting in aperture priority, very, very helpful. You can, in the blink of an eye, just squeeze it up or down, and then it will compensate if you want your image to be darker or brighter without having to change any parameters. So you stay in aperture priority and then you go and compensate the light if you want darker or brighter on your image. But just don't forget to go back to 0 if you're changing location or scene. That might happen. Last but not least, let's talk about how do I focus. Now, a few ways you can focus, and one is like by half pressing this button, and the other one is by pressing the button at the back, and then once it's locked, pressing the shutter. This is called back button focusing, and this is called half press focusing, okay? So I actually made a video I'm dropping down below from the day I decided to go from half press to back button. A lot of professional friends were telling me, try back button focusing, you'll see it's going to change your life. My old camera wasn't that great with it, but I decided to try it with the Sony and I was blown away by the results. A lot of my friends on Canon or even on Nikon are using back button, and it makes it a lot faster. The most important, and you'll see in the details in the video, is that you actually don't have to jump between AFS and AFC. You can stay in AFC all the time, because when you press on that back button, you're going to focus. The moment you release, the focus is locked and you can actually hammer your shutter without refocusing. It's not going to refocus, it's just going to take the photo. Now, if you want to focus continuously, you just keep pressing on that button and then hammer your shutter. So for me, it's a real time saver. I absolutely love it. I recommend it to anyone to try it if you're game for it. Last but not least, if you're shooting pro, if you're shooting session portrait, if you're shooting a wedding, try to lock your settings, like dial in the right exposures and settings for each different scene you're getting to, so that all the photos you're going to be shooting are going to be correctly lit. They're going to be all exposed the same way, which is going to be huge time saver for you in editing. You won't have to do small compensations, small adjustments. It's going to be great. Last thing I didn't talk about was white balance. I leave it in auto white balance most of the time, especially when I'm changing condition very rapidly, because I can always fix it in post since I'm shooting everything in raw images. Remember, don't shoot in JPEG, shoot in RAW, and then work on your photos after, transform them into JPEGs later. Hope that helps you. Any question, drop it below. I'll see you in the next video. Have an amazing day. Bye.